War. War is hell. Throughout the span of human existence, we have slaughtered each other for empires, for religion, for resources, and sometimes simply because a guy named Franz took a wrong turn in Sarajevo. We build statues for generals, we write songs about bravery, and we turn the blood of the fallen into statistics for high school history textbooks that you definitely didn't read because you were too busy drawing cool S shapes in the margins. But what if I told you that two of the greatest superpowers on Earth, the United States of America and the British Empire, once brought their battleships, their cannons, and thousands of troops to the brink of World War III because of a pig? That's right. Not oil, not gold, not ideology. A pig. A single hungry barnyard animal that decided to turn a potato patch into an international geopolitical crisis. This is the story of the pig. War, a conflict so incredibly stupid, so bureaucratically absurd, that it serves as a shining example of why men with big hats and fragile egos should not be allowed to make decisions. So grab a snack, preferably bacon if you want to be thematic, and let's dive into the most chaotic farm dispute in human history. To understand why a pig caused a naval standoff, we have to go back to the year 1846. The vibe in North America was, to put it mildly, tense. The United States was in its manifest destiny phase, which is basically the geopolitical equivalent of a college frat boy shouting, "I'm taking everything," while chugging a beer and smashing a table. Meanwhile, the British Empire, who still owned Canada, was like the grumpy landlord, trying to keep the frat boy from trashing the apartment. For years, the US and Britain argued over the Oregon Country. Both sides claimed it. They stared at each other aggressively across the border, waiting for the other to blink. Finally, on June 15, 1846, they signed the Oregon Treaty. This was supposed to fix everything. The treaty stated that the border between the US and British North America would run along the 49th parallel, straight across the continent to the coast. And then pay attention. This is the important part. To the middle of the channel, which separates the continent from Vancouver's Island, and thence southerly through the middle of the said channel, and of Fuca's Straits, to the Pacific Ocean. Sounds simple, right? The middle of the channel. Easy, clear, precise, except for one tiny insignificant detail. The geography of that area is a mess. There isn't one channel. There are two main channels. And sitting smack dab in the middle of those two channels is a cluster of islands called the San Juan Islands. If you took the Rosario Strait, the eastern channel, the islands belonged to Britain. If you took the Haro Strait, the western channel, the islands belonged to America. Naturally, the British looked at the map and said, "Obviously, we meant the Rosario Strait, because we are British, and we are always right." And the Americans looked at the map and said, "Obviously, we meant the Haro Strait, because we are Americans, and we want more stuff." And then they both just sort of moved in. Lyman was an American farmer who had moved to San Juan Island under the protection of the U.S. Donation Land Claim Act. Basically, the U.S. government said, "Hey, if you move there, the land is yours," conveniently ignoring the fact that the British also said, "Hey, this is ours." Lyman had a nice little cabin and a very precious patch of potatoes. He loved those potatoes. They were his pride and joy. He probably named them. And then meet Charles Griffin. Charles was an employee of the Hudson's Bay Company. He managed the sheep ranch, but he also owned several pigs. Unlike modern factory farming, Charles believed in the free-range lifestyle. He let his pigs roam wherever they wanted, eating whatever they could find. It was a pig paradise. It was a potato nightmare. The conversation that followed is historically documented, and it is the most petty, passive-aggressive neighbor dispute of the 19th century. Cutler said, "Hey man, sorry about your pig. It was eating my potatoes. But look, I'm a reasonable guy. I'll pay you $10 for it." Now, $10 in 1859 was decent money. It wasn't buy a house money, but it was definitely buy a lot of whiskey money. It was a fair price for a pig. Griffin, however, was not in the mood for a fair price. He looked at Cutler, adjusted his monocle. Okay, I don't know if he had a monocle, but he feels like a monocle guy, and said, $10, you scoundrel. That was a prize-breeding pig. I demand $100. $100. That was an insane amount of money. That's the equivalent of demanding a brand new Tesla because someone scratched your skateboard. Cutler, shocked, replied with the line that should be printed on American currency. "I'm not paying you $100. And anyway, your pig was eating my potatoes." And then Charles Griffin delivered the line that started the war, the line that drew the sand in the line. He said, "It is up to you to keep your potatoes out of my pig." Let's pause and analyze the logic here. Keep your potatoes out of my pig. Imagine someone breaks into your house, eats your sandwich, and then sues you because your sandwich got in their mouth. That is the level of gaslighting we are dealing with. Cutler told Griffin to go kick rocks. Griffin stormed off and reported Cutler to the local British authorities. The British authorities, seeing a chance to finally kick these American squatters off the island, threatened to arrest Cutler for trespassing and destruction of property. Now, if this had happened today, Cutler would have just posted a rant on Twitter, and Griffin would have been canceled. But in 1859, when you felt threatened by a foreign power, you didn't call a lawyer. You called the military. The American settlers on San Juan Island panicked. They drafted a petition asking for U.S. military protection. This petition landed on the desk of Brigadier General William S. Harney. General Harney was the commander of the Department of Oregon. He was known for a few things: being a competent soldier, being incredibly impulsive, and absolutely positively, with every fiber of his being, hating the British. Harney was basically looking for an excuse. Any excuse. If a British person sneezed in the wrong direction, Harney was ready to invade. He was known as an Anglophobe, which is a fancy word for guy who really wants to punch someone with a British accent. So when he read that, a British official had threatened an American citizen over a pig, it was go time. He didn't check with Washington. He didn't check with the president. He just looked at his calendar, saw Tuesday start war, and went for it. Harney ordered the 9th Infantry Regiment to San Juan Island. And who did he put in charge? None other than Captain George Pickett. Yes, that George Pickett. The guy who would later become famous for Pickett's Charge at the Battle of Gettysburg, a military maneuver that involved running across an open field into cannon fire. Not exactly known for his subtle tactical genius. But in 1859, he was just a captain with fantastic hair and a chip on his shoulder. The British had hundreds of Royal Marines and enough firepower to turn Pickett's camp into a parking lot within 5 minutes. Pickett's response: he dug in. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped on an island. He wrote a letter to Harney saying, "We will make a Bunker Hill of it," which is military speak for "we are all going to die, but it'll look cool in the history books." By August, the U.S. had 461 soldiers and 14 cannons on the island. They built a fort aptly named American Camp. The British responded by sending more ships. Now there were 5 warships, including the flagship HMS Ganges, and over 2,000 sailors and Marines. The ratio was about 5-1 in favor of the British. The cannons on the British ships could level the entire island. The tension was so thick, you could cut it with a bayonet. The soldiers were taunting each other. The British drilled their Marines on the decks of the ships in full view of the Americans. The Americans practiced loading their cannons. It all came down to one man, Rear Admiral Robert Baines. He ordered his captains not to fire unless the Americans fired first. Pickett on the other side had similar orders: don't fire unless fired upon. So we ended up with the world's most dangerous staring contest. Thousands of armed men, dozens of heavy cannons, 5 warships all pointed at each other, and nobody did anything. They just watched and waited for weeks. Buchanan needed to shut this down immediately. He needed a fixer. He needed a legend. He sent General Winfield Scott. Winfield Scott was the highest-ranking general in the U.S. Army. He was a hero of the War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War. He was nicknamed Old Fuss and Feathers. By 1859, he was old, overweight, and couldn't ride a horse anymore, but his brain was still sharp. Scott traveled for 6 weeks to get to the Pacific Northwest. When he arrived, he basically walked into the room and told everyone to chill out. He met with Governor Douglas, who was still grumpy, and Admiral Baines, who was chilling. They visited each other's camps constantly. They celebrated the 4th of July together, which is hilarious, inviting the British to celebrate your independence from them. They celebrated Queen Victoria's birthday together. They held athletic competitions. It is said that the biggest threat to the soldiers on San Juan Island during this time was not bullets, but liver failure from too much alcohol. The Germans looked at the hydrographic charts. They measured the volume of water. They realized the Haro Strait moved way more water and was the primary geographic divide. On October 21, 1872, the Kaiser issued his ruling. The ruling was in favor of the United States. The Haro Strait was the correct boundary. The San Juan Islands belonged to Uncle Sam. The British troops at English camp packed up their stuff. They didn't storm out in anger. They didn't sabotage the island. They shook hands with their American friends, probably exchanged some keep in touch letters, and sailed away. The final tally of the Pig War duration, 13 years. Armies involved 2 superpowers. Casualties, 1 pig. Lyman Cutler, the man who started it all, didn't even get in trouble. He kept his farm. Though ironically, he never paid the $10 nor the $100. Today, San Juan Island is a beautiful tourist destination in Washington state. You can visit American Camp and English Camp. They are national historical parks. It is the only place in a U.S. national park where a foreign flag, the British Union Jack, is allowed to fly daily as a sign of respect for the friendship that formed there. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, or I will send a pig to eat your garden. For about 13 years, things were weirdly okay. It was a joint occupation, even if nobody officially called it that. The British Hudson's Bay Company set up a sheep ranch called Bellevue Sheep Farm on San Juan Island to assert their dominance via fluffy animals. The Americans, mostly settlers and prospectors, who had failed to find gold and were now just looking for free land, settled nearby. It was a classic sitcom setup. You had the uptight British sheep farmers on one side drinking tea and measuring wool, and the rugged American settlers on the other planting potatoes and complaining about taxes. They lived in relative peace. They traded. They probably talked about the weather. It was a diplomatic powder keg, sure, but the fuse hadn't been lit yet. Until the morning of June 15, 1859, exactly 13 years to the day after the treaty was signed. Fate, it seems, has a twisted sense of humor. Meet Lyman Cutler. On that fateful morning, Lyman Cutler woke up, stretched, grabbed his coffee or whatever mud water they drank in 1859, and looked out his window. And what did he see? A large black pig in his garden, eating his potatoes. Again. This wasn't the first time. This pig was a repeat offender. It was the Al Capone of root vegetables. Lyman had chased it off before. He had complained to the British. But this morning, Lyman chose violence. Lyman grabbed his musket, stormed out into the morning. Dew took aim, and blam. The pig was dead. The first and only casualty of the war had fallen. Lyman, realizing he might have overreacted slightly, stood over the cooling carcass of the pig. The adrenaline faded. The realization set in. He had just shot a British pig on disputed territory. Cutler, to his credit, tried to do the right thing. He went to Charles Griffin's house to apologize. On July 27, 1859, Pickett sailed to San Juan Island with 86 soldiers. He marched them onto the beach, planted a flag near the British sheep farm, and declared, "This island is American property. Come at me, bros." Paraphrased, of course, but that was the energy. The British on Vancouver Island were confused. Then they were annoyed. Then they were furious. James Douglas, the governor of British Columbia, was not a man who took kindly to American aggression. He heard that 66 Americans were camping on his island, and he decided to respond with proportionate force. Just kidding. He went full overkill mode. Governor Douglas dispatched the HMS Tribune, a 31-gun steam frigate, to the island. Then he sent the HMS Satellite. Then the HMS Plumper. Yes, it was really called the Plumper. Stop giggling. Within days, Captain Pickett and his 66 men were staring down 3 British warships with massive cannons trained directly on their camp. The situation was absurd. You had 66 guys protecting a potato patch against the might of the Royal Navy. The British captain, Captain Geoffrey Hornby of the Tribune, was under orders from Governor Douglas to land his Marines and kick the Americans out. But here is where things get interesting. The British military operates on a strict chain of command, but they also operate on a strict code of, "Let's not start World War III if we don't have to." Pickett issued a statement, "If you land on this shore, I will open fire." Hornby looked at his cannons. He looked at Pickett's 66 dudes. He knew he could wipe them out. But he also knew that firing the first shot would trigger a war between the US and Britain. And nobody wanted to be the guy who started a global conflict because of a pig. So Hornby waited. He stalled. He asked for more specific orders. While the British hesitated, General Harney kept pumping reinforcements onto the island. Admiral Baines arrived from the main British naval base to take command. Governor Douglas, who was practically foaming at the mouth by this point, ordered Baines to land the Marines and engage the Americans. "Kick them off," Douglas screamed, presumably, while crushing a teacup in his bare hand. Baines looked at the order. He looked at the island. He looked at the pig carcass figuratively. The pig was long gone by now. And then he delivered the single greatest sentence in the history of diplomatic restraint. He refused the order. He wrote back to Douglas saying, "To engage 2 great nations in a war over a squabble about a pig is foolish." Can we just take a moment to appreciate the sheer common sense level 100 of Admiral Baines? In a world full of hot-headed generals and ego-driven governors, Baines was the only adult in the room. He realized that historians of the future would laugh at them if they died for bacon. Meanwhile, news of this insanity finally began to travel east. You have to remember, in 1859, there was no Twitter, no CNN, and the telegraph didn't reach all the way to the San Juan Islands yet. It took weeks for the report to reach Washington, D.C. and London. When the report finally landed on President James Buchanan's desk in September, he nearly had a stroke. Buchanan is generally considered one of the worst presidents in U.S. history, usually because he failed to stop the Civil War, but give the guy a break here. He was trying to keep the North and South from killing each other, and suddenly he gets a letter saying, "Surprise, General Harney is about to start a war with England over a farm animal." Buchanan was like, "I literally do not have the bandwidth for this right now." In London, the reaction was similar. The British Parliament was baffled. "We are going to war for what San Juan? Where is that? Is there gold? No, just potatoes." Good heavens, Scott proposed a simple solution. "Look, we both claim the island. Until the lawyers figure this out, let's just share it." The proposal was accepted. The U.S. would keep a camp on the southern tip of the island, American camp, with a maximum of 100 soldiers. The British would build a camp on the northern tip, English camp, with a maximum of 100 Marines. The massive warships would leave. The cannons would be put away. Harney was reassigned, which is military speak for fired and sent away. so he doesn't touch anything sharp. Pickett was eventually called back to fight in the Civil War. And thus began the strangest occupation in military history. For the next 12 years, yes, 12 years, the British and American troops lived on opposite ends of this tiny island. You would think they would hate each other, right? Enemies, rivals. Nope, they became best friends. It turned into a 12-year frat party. The British had better food and whiskey. The Americans had, well, they had charm, I guess. While the soldiers were having the time of their lives, the U.S. Civil War happened. The U.S. was a bit busy dealing with that whole brother fighting brother thing to worry about the island. The British, being gentlemen, decided not to attack the island, while the U.S. was distracted. Classy move, Britain. Finally, in 1871, the U.S. and Britain signed the Treaty of Washington to settle all their outstanding issues. They agreed to let a neutral third party decide who owned the San Juan Islands. They needed someone powerful, someone unbiased, someone with a majestic mustache. They chose Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. The Kaiser took his job seriously. He didn't just flip a coin. He assigned 3 experts, Dr. Grimm, Dr. Kiepert, and Dr. Goldschmidt, to review the case. The British legal team argued that the wording "southerly" in the treaty implied the Rosario Strait. The American legal team argued that the middle of the channel clearly meant the widest, deepest channel Harrow. So why does this matter? Why did I just spend all this time talking about a pig? Because the Pig War represents a what-if moment. In 1859, the U.S. was fragile. If war had broken out with Britain, the North would have been fighting the British Empire. 2 years later, when the Civil War started, the South would have likely allied with Britain more formally. A war in 1859 could have led to a Confederate victory in the 1860s. It could have changed the entire map of North America. The U.S. might not exist as we know it today. All of that history hung in the balance, and it was saved by restraint, by hesitation, by a refusal to escalate. In an era where we often praise the aggressors and the conquerors, the Pig War is a monument to the people who said, "No, this is stupid, I'm not doing it," and that, my friends, is a lesson worth learning, even if it cost us a really nice pig. R.I.P. the pig. You were delicious, probably. Thanks for watching.